Good morning, friends. Welcome to your morning start on my little podcast called A Moment with Hales. I'm so glad you decided to join me to get your day started with a biblical perspective. Today, we're going to continue in our Old Testament idols series, so I hope you have some caffeine and I hope you enjoy. I'm running a little behind today, so this podcast is going to be a little ad-libbed, so we'll see how it goes. We are going to finish with my last thought on Baal for now. Well, you never know if he's going to come up later. But as we know, Baal was considered the storm god. They said he controlled the weather and the clouds, the storm clouds, etc. But I think it's kind of funny that God appeared as a cloud in the Old Testament. In Exodus 13, it says God led the Israelites towards the promised land by day in a pillar of a cloud and by night a pillar of fire. And Exodus 40 says the cloud was presented in the tent of the congregation and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So we do know back in the Old Testament, God was a cloud, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night as he led his people. Again, this is showing the superiority to Baal. It's kind of funny that he was a cloud and that other people considered Baal controlling of the clouds. So we all know, of course, he was the true God, Yahweh. He still is today, and he was not controlled by Baal. Baal could not control him, and he still appeared as a cloud. So I think that was kind of funny. And you can learn more about Baal worship in the last episode I did. Well, there's Old Testament idol worship, Baal 1, and then the last episode I did Baal worship 2, if you want to learn more. But today we are going to be specifically talking about one of Baal's foes. I guess you could say a foe, Molek. Like Baal, Molek was considered a Canaanite deity, but they were not really best friends. In fact, they were more like rivals, competing for the attention and devotion of their followers. Baal was the god of storm and fertility, while Molek was the god of fire and sacrifice. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I've heard about Baal a lot more than I've heard about Molek, and I think it's because Baal is mentioned way more in scripture than Molek is, but Molek, I don't know, I just feel like he is another level. So some say that Molek is the god of the underworld, and his name means king. The article that I found from a website called Medium kind of compares Molek and Baal like this. Molek was the bad boy, the one who brought fire, wealth, and power to his followers. He was scary and cruel. He was also a tyrant, and he liked to show his authority by demanding sacrifices. But he also had a lot of enemies. He had to deal with his rival Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, who wanted to destroy him and take his land. He also had to deal with his angry mother Ashari, the goddess of the sea, who wanted to stop him from killing her children and to respect her. He had to deal with his arch enemy Yahweh, the God of Israel, who wanted to banish him and take his place. Some say that Baal and Molek were actually the same god, just with different names and faces. Okay, this is me inserting into this article really quick. So my thoughts. When I'm researching these gods, I'm not going to lie, you guys, it's very confusing. Like I said, I am not a scholar or an ancient studier of all these philosophies and gods and all of these things, religions. But I will say there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of argument that this god was actually this god. And when they said this, they were referring to this god. So if you really want to learn more, I suggest you jump in because I'm doing the best I can with the information that I have. But there's a lot of arguments out there of what God did what. And that's why I'm kind of sticking with the ones that I'm just finding in scripture because I feel like that's relevant to what we're doing. Okay, so anyways, we're going to continue. Let me find where I was. Some people say that Baal and Molek were actually the same god, just with different names and faces. They say that the word Molek means king, and that Baal also it was called king. They say some of the stories and rituals of Baal and Molek were similar and that they both worshipped in the same places and at the same time. They say that Baal and Molek were both aspects of the same divine power and represented two sides of the same coin. But others say that Baal and Molek were completely different gods and that they had nothing to do with one another. They say the word Molek means shame and that Baal was never called that. They say some of the stories and rituals of Baal and Molek were different and that they were both opposed by the same God, Yahweh. They say that Baal and Molek were both enemies of the true God and that they represented the two choices of the human heart. Child sacrifice was also a part of worship to Molek, and you can learn more about that also in our last episode to Baal, because it was also to Baal as well. But I think it was a lot more to Molek from what I'm seeing. So, of course, this is contested among historians, but we're going to look into what scripture says. Leviticus 18 says, God commands his people, you shall not give any of your children, offer them to Molek, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. The Bible connects the Tophet, or Tophat, I don't know how to say that, but basically it's a location in Jerusalem in the Valley of Hinnom where the worshipers engaged in rituals involving passing a child through fire. So most people conclude that's for child sacrifice. This place was associated with Molek. But the same activity of causing children to pass over fire is mentioned without reference to Molek in numerous verses throughout the Bible, in Deuteronomy, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, the book of Jeremiah, and the book of Ezekiel. Therefore, some scholars argue that the term Molek should be used to understand basically as a meaning of a Molek offering rather than Molek as a god. A Molek offering was a sacrifice ritual in which a child or animal was sacrificed as an offering. And this term is derived from a Phoenician and Carthaginian verb, yilk, I guess, which means to offer or present. The term appears in phrases which means sacrifice a human. So we have two separate arguments. Molek was an actual god, or Molek was a sacrifice ritual that was done. It was an action. So even with the two arguments, I'm going to continue this podcast presenting Molek as a false idol because that's what I think it was. I don't think it was just like a verb describing child sacrifice. And I also think there's more evidence supporting it that he was an idol in scripture and in history as well. So in 1 Kings, we do have a reference to Molek. It says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughters, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast and loved them. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He also followed Ashareth, the goddess of the Sidons, and Molek, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. Okay, I'm just going to insert here. Solomon was the wisest man to ever live, and women were still his downfall. So women, we do have some power, I will say. It's an interesting thought here that Solomon fell so far with everything he had going for him. Continuing in 1 Kings, on the hill of East Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemeth, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molek, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their god. I think a small takeaway here is you are the company you keep. 1 Corinthians 15 says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. I think it's kind of ironic, but we're going to use some verses from Proverbs, which Solomon wrote. Proverbs 14:7 says, stay away from a fool. You will not find knowledge on their lips. Proverbs 25:26 says, like a muddied spring or a polluted well are the righteous who give way to the wicked. So Solomon really should have taken his own advice, or maybe he really did learn by experience and gives us some really good warnings. Solomon chose his love of women over his obedience to the Lord. If he would have surrounded himself with God-fearing women, think of all that could have been accomplished for his people and the Lord and how the kingdom would have been furthered. Instead, he was a fool and he was put into these marriages and partnerships for what? Perhaps alliances with other nations who were evil, or maybe for a fleeting rendezvous with a lady he fancied in a particular day. I don't know, but it's definitely interesting that this was how Solomon's life ended. I think we should do a study on Solomon because he's fascinating to me, and I love Proverbs and I love Ecclesiastes, and he was the wisest man to ever live, and this was his downfall. Very interesting. I'm sure there's more to the story that I'm not covering, but we should definitely look into that. Okay, so that's that about Solomon. He brought in all these other wives and concubines, whatever, from evil places. So, of course, just like Moab and Jezebel, same thing. The women influenced the men and brought in these terrible religions that did really, really evil things. The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah describes the ancient rites, telling us that God says, "They built high places in Baal in the valley of Beth Hinnom and sacrificed their sons and daughters to Molek, bringing sin upon Judah. This I never commanded them, nor did it enter my mind that they should practice such abominations." Also in Leviticus, we see mention of Molek. It says, "Tell the Israelites, anyone, whether an Israelite or an alien residing in Israel, who gives any of his offspring to Molek shall be put to death. Let his fellow citizens stone him. I, God myself, will turn against such a man and cut him off from the body of his people for giving his offspring to Molek. He has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name." So obviously, I think it's pretty clear that God was not pro-child or human sacrifice in any way, shape, or form. And like I said in the last episode, I just think it's so cool that the contrast between the true God giving and sacrificing his son for us, in contrast to the Old Testament idols asking us, the people, to sacrifice their children. So it just again shows how God is superior and different than all the other gods out there. I just think it's a really cool contrast. So anyways, moving forward, as we learned that Baal evolved into Zeus and then into Jupiter as time continued, I tried to find what Molek's evolvement, if you will, was, but I could not seem to nail down if Molek worship was taken into the future or who Molek could have evolved into or what god he could have evolved into, or what Molek worship looks like today. The only thing that really links that I could find, and again, I'm not a scholar. Someone might be able to give more information about this. You can comment below if you have more information of what Molek worship looks like today. But many people do consider abortion rights as a reference or like a form of homage to Molek. So there's lots of different theories regarding Molek's lineage, and we're just going to get into one. Some say that his mother was Ishtare, so I think that's how you say it. Sorry if it's not. From the small research I did, it seems this goddess is called many different names in many different tribes. However, they're all paying homage to the same deity. You have Ishare, Asarith, Astarte, and Ashtar. They're all manifestations of the same goddess. It's just when she was worshipped in different regions, she was called a different name. Ashare's association with fertility was not limited to her association necessarily with trees. She was often depicted with pronounced sexual features. Idols of Ashare, often called Astare figurines, are representative of the Ashara tree, as they have bodies which resemble tree trunks, also further accentuating the goddess's connection to fertility and her line with the status as the mother goddess. We hear about Ashare poles. They're mentioned throughout scripture. I've talked about them before. These are associated with trees or carvings that look like Ashare, I guess. The poles, you can Google it. There's a lot of different theories of what these poles specifically look like, but it was very clear that God did not want his people involved with them. In Deuteronomy 16, it says, "You shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image near the altar which you built for yourself to the Lord your God." There is also a story in the book of Judges where God instructs Gideon to cut down the Asherah pole and use it as a wood offering or an offering in a burnt offering. So we see that many of the time these poles are mentioned as heresy, and you can also look through scripture and find the reference to it many times in the Old Testament. Ashtara is still worshipped today by pagans and Wiccans as the goddess of love and fertility. And that is Molek's mother. And that's all I really have on Molek for all I really could find in scripture. And in regards to his relevancy today, it doesn't seem like he's super relevant, at least on the internet from what I've researched. I'm sure conspiracy theorists would say otherwise. But yeah, So friends, how can we apply this information today? This did turn out more like a history lesson, which was unintentional, so I'm just going to share a personal thought as we close. Even though it feels ancient, this study is important. Understanding the deities and the idols that were considered God's rivals or foes or whatever, it matters. Because we know God was and is superior. Looking back thousands of years and having scripture and knowing the full picture now, it was foolish, we can say, to turn to any other idol that was asking you to participate in evil. Of course, having all of scripture, knowing Jesus was coming and he was going to pay the price, and then the church was going to come out and come together and everything was going to be fulfilled. How could you follow an ancient idol like that? How could you participate or follow evil? And while hindsight is 2020, the question remains, what is culture asking us to pursue and participate in now? Because we know evil is still out there, and it might be influencing us more than we realize. Our purpose is not found by being relevant to culture or in culture. It is clear as believers that we are to be set apart. We are holy. We are different than the world. As we grow in our spiritual maturity, our desire will be to remove ourselves from the dark. Romans 13 says, "The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of the darkness and put on the armor of light." Ephesians 5 says, "For at one time you were in darkness, but now you are the light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true." It sounds heavy when you hear darkness, evil. You think about these terrible child sacrifice rituals that were going on in the Old Testament. But I just want to say now in 2024, darkness is masked as innocence. I think there's a lot of things that we're presented with in our culture that's portrayed to us as innocent, as fun, as light, as little, as non-impactful, mindless. But when you really look at the root of these things, they're nefarious, they're addictive, they are evil, they are worthless, they are purposeless, and they are dark. And I think sometimes we need to step back and take inventory of what we're consuming in our culture and where we are placing our value. Because as believers, as we grow in our spiritual maturity, our pursuit of Christ will illuminate any darkness that we're allowing to seep into our lives, even unknowingly, even innocently, even little things that maybe we might not consider evil outright. But once you take a step back and look at it, you're like, I think this is coming from a really dark place. Darkness abounds in the world. I mean, just look at the news. I don't even have to say, there's so many horrible things that's been going on and coming out. But our responsibility is to keep sharing the truth because our God is superior and our God is sufficient. The Bible is truth. And we have a responsibility being filled with the power of the Lord, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, to live in such a way that we stand up for and share truth. Well, thanks for listening, friends. I hope you had some caffeine before this episode because there's a lot of information in there. Also, if you haven't checked out my YouTube channel, I do have one called A Moment with Hales. You'll see different content there in regards to my garden tours. Obviously, you can't watch a garden tour on a podcast. You can listen to it, though, if you really want to. I did just post an episode this weekend, a coffee and conspiracy episode about weather modification, which is a huge topic right now if you want to go ahead and take a listen. It's also posted on my podcast as well. Again, you guys are an encouragement to me. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have fabulous days, and I'll be talking to you soon.